Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
So the question is, why do we refer to people who were born and live in the diaspora as African? So as you can hear, I speak a colonial language imposed on us, English, with an accent of another colonial language, German. because I was born in Germany and I live in Germany. Nevertheless, I belong to Africa. I am African and I fight for the African liberation and unity. But why is that so? So for that I would like to quote Kwame Nkrumah. So he said that all people of African descent, whether they live in the North or South America, the Caribbean, or any part of the world, are African and belong to the African nation. And that is the great thing about Pan-Africanism. So even if I live in Germany or any other country in the world, I am still an African, because I recognize that our core interest and progress as people is intrinsically linked to the liberation of Africa. So the AFPRP, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, recognizes that all African people, born and living all over the world, are one people with one identity, one history, one culture, one nation, and one destiny, an African destiny. So we do not see the term people as a biological unit, but as a political, sociological, and historical entity. So the total liberation and unification of all African people worldwide is the highest and most important goal for us. And this can only be achieved through collective organization in Africa and in the diaspora.
Here on Democracy Now!, I'm Amy Goodman. Former CIA operative and Cuban exile Luis Posada Carriles has died. He died on Wednesday just outside Miami. He was 90 years old. Posada Carriles is best known as the suspected mastermind of the 1976 bombing of a Cubana airline jet. For decades, the U.S. refused to extradite Posada Carriles for terrorism charges, despite demands by Cuba and Venezuela. He later publicly admitted ties to a series of hotel bombings in Cuba. In 1997 and 2000, he was arrested in Panama City for plotting to blow up an auditorium where Fidel Castro would be speaking. Despite his record, Luis Posada Carriles died a free man in Florida. For more, we're joined by José Pertierra, a Cuban attorney based in Washington, D.C., represented the Venezuelan government in its efforts to extradite Luis Posada Carriles, and also represented Elian Gonzalez in the 2000-2001, when Elian Gonzalez was here in the United States, eventually sent back to Cuba to be with his dad. Jose, if you could start off by talking just about the Cubana Airlines bombing in 1976, and the Cubana Airlines bombing, how many people died, and the significance of who this man is who has died in Miami today?
Thank you, Amy. Good morning. The Cubana airline disaster in 1976 was at the time the worst airline passenger disaster or act of terrorism against a passenger airline in the history of aviation. It killed 73 innocent people, including 24 members of the juvenile fencing team from Cuba. There was a little 9-year-old girl on board named Sabrina. She also died. Posada Carriles was the mastermind of the bombing. He masterminded the placing of 2 bombs, one in the front of the plane, one in the back of the plane in the restroom, that exploded in midair. And the plane crashed into a bay called near Paradise Beach in Trinidad. And no bodies, or some bodies were recovered, but most of the bodies were not. They went to the bottom of the sea where they're still lying. Venezuela presented charges against Posada Carriles because there was overwhelming evidence of his involvement. There was even a confession by the persons who planted the bombs, who were arrested in Trinidad. They were interrogated, and they confessed to having worked for Posada Carriles. They even tried to communicate with Posada Carriles by telephone, by calling Caracas. This evidence was enough for Venezuela to charge him with 73 counts of first-degree murder.
We don't have much time, Jose Pertierra, and I want to ask you, so that happened, 73 people dead. How did he end up dying a free man in Miami this past Wednesday?
Amy, Venezuela, well, he escaped from jail in Panama, where he was being held, as you said, for for trying to bomb an auditorium full of people. But after getting out of jail in Panama, receiving a pardon, he came to the United States, to Miami, and Venezuela presented a request for extradition, and the United States simply refused to extradite him. Instead, it charged him with violating immigration law, lying on immigration forms, for which he was ultimately acquitted, even though there was admissions by Posada Carriles that he had masterminded a string of bombings in Havana that resulted in the murder of an Italian businessman, and he lied about those on the immigration forms. But even though there was evidence of that, including a taped confession of Posada Carriles to New York Times correspondent Ana Luis Bardache, nonetheless, he was acquitted of that, and the U.S. refused to extradite him. Why? Because he was the United States man in Caracas. He worked for the CIA for, by his own admission, over 24 years. It just goes to show you, if you've got friends in high places, even though you may be a terrorist, the United States will protect you.
And I want to get to, before the end, Luis Posada Carriles' death came days after a Cuban plane crashed and burned right after takeoff on Friday outside Havana, killing 111 people. It was another Cubana Airlines jet. Critics say the crash is partly due to the decades-old U.S. trade embargo, which makes it so difficult for Cuba to acquire newer aircraft. I believe this plane was something like 40 years old. In this last minute we have, can you talk about the fallout from this tragic crash?
Well, the investigation is going on. There's absolutely no evidence it was an act of terrorism. There was either pilot error or something wrong with the plane. What you're saying is absolutely true, however. Cuba has a fleet of aging planes simply because they cannot buy new planes that either are made in the United States or contain parts that are made in the United States. And most jet planes today have parts that were made in the United States. It's a brutal blockade that's been imposed by the United States against Cuba since 1961. And that results in tragedy, lack of medicine sometimes, lack of plane parts. This tragedy probably stems from that. And Cuba is doing everything in its power right now to investigate what happened. Two survivors are in critical condition. The prognosis is not good for one of them. And Cuba, I'm sure, will try to prevent this from happening again. But the best way for the United States to respond is not to give prayers and condolences, but to lift the embargo and allow Cuba to purchase planes with American parts and fly safely over Cuban skies.
Jose Percheri, I want to thank you for being with us. Cuban attorney based in Washington, D.C., represented the Venezuelan government in efforts to extradite Luis Posada Carriles, who died on Wednesday, a free man in Miami. That does it for our broadcast, Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feldstein, Aguzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Nat Needham, and Libby Rainey. On Monday, 1968, 50-year look-back special from Catonsville to the My Lai massacre to the Columbia student strikes to the King assassination. Tune in. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Onyesanwu. This is my comrade Monica, and you are watching Weekly Pan-African News, presented to you by the New Mexico chapter of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We do this show every single Thursday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. We've been doing it for almost 2 years at this point, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. The All African People's Revolutionary Party, just a little bit about us, is a revolutionary Pan-African mass political party based in Africa, founded in Africa over 50 years ago by Kwame Nkrumah, the first democratically elected president of the first country to gain independence from colonialism in West Africa. That nation was Ghana. After Ghana gained its independence, Nkrumah said on its first Independence Day that the independence of Ghana was meaningless without the total liberation of the African continent under scientific socialism. So the APRP is the party he called for to lead that work forward. And so we exist to this day all over the world. Our strongest and most robust chapters are in Africa, but we have chapters throughout Europe, Canada, the Caribbean, and of course the United States, where we are. So we do weekly Pan-African news every single Thursday, 1 p.m. Mountain Time. We started doing it at the beginning of the pandemic because we understood that it was not going to be safe to gather in person for our people, particularly in the United States, where our folks are abandoned and exploited by the system, where they receive no kind of safety net whatsoever, not even healthcare. And so we were like, our people are going to be extremely susceptible to this virus. We cannot have them in person. We have to continue to build with them. How do we do it? The show is one of the many ways we came up with to do that. So if you are a frequent watcher of the show, then you know that we always start off with a couple of things. The first thing that we always do is that we call in an ancestor. We call it an ancestor. And we understand, we call it an ancestor because we understand as African revolutionary women fighting in the 21st century that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes, that the work that we do today would not be possible without the contributions and sacrifices of the people that came before us, the people that fought and struggled and built and learned and figured out how to build a revolution to lay the groundwork for us to continue to do this work today. So we have to honor them. We have to lift them up. We also have to tell the truth about them. Because one thing is for certain, if you are an African revolutionary hero, or if you're any kind of oppressed person resisting this system of capitalism and imperialism, this system is going to lie on you. It is going to tell lies about you constantly. And the ancestor we have today is very clear evidence of that. That ancestor is none other than Che Guevara, hero of the Cuban Revolution, also a very controversial figure in the United States and in capitalist countries in general, because capitalism has spread just a whole universe of lies about this man, y'all, to the point where some people hear his name and immediately spit on the ground. Like they have nothing but disdain for him on the basis of these lies created by capitalism. But we know the truth as revolutionary African people. We know the contributions that Che made, not just to the liberation of Cuba, but also to the liberation of Africa. Che helped build the foundation for Cuba's revolutionary assistance, its military assistance, its political assistance, its medical assistance to anti-colonial struggles in Africa. Che helped lay the groundwork for that. Che also helped liberation struggles throughout the Western Hemisphere, which is actually how he came to be in the place where he was killed. So he was born June 14th, 1928, and he died, and he died October 9th, 1967. So the anniversary of his death was just this past week. He was actually assassinated on the orders of the Central Intelligence Agency, Criminals in Action, the CIA of the United States, in Bolivia. He was in Bolivia attempting to initiate a revolutionary struggle there against fascist imperialist rule. Unfortunately, that mission was unsuccessful, and then Che was killed, again, on the orders of the CIA. And recently, in Florida, the right-wing Republican governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, gave a Medal of Freedom to the Gusano who assassinated Che Guevara. That is how backwards Florida is in 2021. This happened back in September. This man was giving a medal for murdering a hero in cold blood on the orders of the most dangerous empire that's ever existed. But we honor Che no matter what they did to his body. His memory and his contribution lives on. He is a hero. He was a good man, without question, and he was in lifelong solidarity with the liberation struggles of all oppressed peoples in Africa and all over the world. So we honor Che Guevara as the ancestor on the show today. The second thing that we always do in the beginning of every show is that we want to acknowledge that we are talking to y'all from someone else's land, from stolen land. And when we do a land acknowledgement, it's not just to say it and move on. Like when we say this is stolen land, we are saying that we are going to help fight to take it back. Just like land was stolen in Africa by the same people who stole it here, and we are going to take our land back, we are fighting in solidarity with indigenous nations of the Western Hemisphere to take their land back too. So we are speaking to y'all from Tiwa territory. The Tiwa Pueblo is the rightful owner of the land that the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico was built on. Land was taken, land must be returned, land back, not a metaphor, a promise. So that concludes our introduction. And now we're going to jump into the other thing that we do on every single show, and that is the political education segment. The political education segment. Every single week, we do a deep dive into a different topic from a revolutionary Pan-African perspective. This week, we're continuing the Cuba trend by talking about the history of U.S.-sponsored terrorist attacks on Cuba. You might know about the blockade. You might know that the US government and media constantly lies on Cuba, but do you know the extent to which the US empire has gone to attack the Cuban Revolution? Do you know these people have shot down planes? They have deliberately released deadly viruses. They have blown up civilian buildings. They have attempted assassinations of Cuban political figures. They have even tried outright invasions. The U.S. has gone soft at nothing to attempt to attack the Cuban Revolution, and this history is very, very little known. So we're going to talk about a few of the incidents of U.S.-sponsored terrorism in Cuba, but first I want to open the conversation by talking about why is this happening? Like, why does the U.S. go so hard to attack the Cuban Revolution? Why does the U.S. have such a hard-on for Cuba? Why can't they just leave Cuba alone? It's a couple of things. First is that Cuba is a revolutionary socialist country just 100 miles, actually less than 100 miles, 90 miles off of the southeast coast of the United States. The United States is obviously a capitalist empire. The United States has an interest in making sure that the capitalist economic system is the only option that exists for the entire planet. The US would prefer it if it could treat every single other nation as its personal plantation to extract from and exploit as it pleases. Socialism, on the other hand, is a system where the means of production, the wealth, the resources, the land of a nation are collectively and democratically controlled by the poor and working class, is a direct threat to those interests of the United States. If, for example, a non-European country, a majority African country, rich in resources and land, decides to nationalize those resources and land, decides to build an economic system where the resources and land are used for the good of the people living in that nation, well, that's just one more nation the US cannot freely exploit. So the existence of socialism anywhere, the US empire considers a direct threat to its economic and political interests. It wants capitalism to be the only option on the table because it wants to be able to steal from and kill and exploit whoever it wants. The other thing about Cuba that drives the US up the wall is that Cuba is not only a revolutionary socialist nation 90 miles off the coast of Southeast Florida, it is also a majority African nation. Quiet as it's kept. Like when you go there, like when you see Cubans on TV, they look like Pitbull and Gloria Estefan. But when you go to Cuba, the island, it is immediately obvious that the majority of the people living there have African ancestry. So, not only is this a revolutionary socialist nation that defied capitalism, that defeated US and Spanish imperialism, it is also a revolutionary socialist country that is majority African, that is spitting in the face of a white supremacist empire. They cannot take it. They're supposed to be better than us. They're supposed to be able to defeat us no matter what. And Cuba's like, actually, we're going to do our own thing, and you can like try to mess with it if you want to, but we are so organized and committed that you are not going to be successful. No matter what the U.S. tries, and we're going to talk about the extent it's gone to try to attack Cuba, Cuba is always able to overcome what the U.S. throws at it. And those are African people doing that. And the last thing I want to touch on is that Cuba had a revolution. Cuba defeated U.S. imperialism and Spanish imperialism before that. Cuba built a revolutionary society using a revolutionary strategy and ideology, certainly influenced by Marxism-Leninism, but also adapted to the Cuban condition and adapted to the Caribbean and Latin American condition. And so that means that Cuba was not just an example for Cubans, but Cuba was an example for people struggling against imperialism and capitalism all over the world, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America. When the Cuban Revolution popped off in the U.S. backyard and they began successfully repelling the attacks of the U.S. empire, it was an example for every single oppressed nation in the Western Hemisphere, all over the world, that the U.S. empire was actually defeatable and that there's strategies that we could learn from to apply in our own context to defeat them too. Cuba was an example of revolution and liberation for the entire oppressed world. And like I just said, the United States wants to treat the global south, all of these oppressed nations, like its personal plantations. If they start having revolutions, if they start building socialism, it cuts off the US's ability to exploit us. And Cuba showed that it's possible. So it's about being socialist, it's about being African, and it's about the model of resistance that wasn't just limited to Cuba, but that spread across the world. It showed that the US, despite all of the lies of white supremacy and capitalism and empire, was defeatable. It was defeated by a poor, majority African nation, much smaller, much fewer resources, but still successful against this giant beast. Can you understand why the US would want to seek to destroy such an example? And then beyond that, Cuba's assisting liberation struggles in Africa. It aided anti-colonial struggles across the Andean continent. Cuba assisted liberation struggles throughout Latin America. Cuba was close with other revolutionary states, like Venezuela. They're still close to this day, with Bolivia, still close to this day. So Cuba was just like, it was like a freedom contagion that the U.S. could not contain in its own backyard. And so this is why the U.S. has gone so hard to attack the Cuban Revolution. It is an example that it cannot abide. But unfortunately for the U.S., Cuba has superior organization and a commitment to being free. And so there's very little that they've effectively been able to do to attack the revolution. But still, we have to talk about these attacks because they are ongoing, because they are costing Cuban lives, and because they are happening in our names as citizens of this empire. We have to have clarity and awareness about how the U.S. attacks liberation struggles around the world, because we have a responsibility as people living in the belly to stop this. We cannot allow a government that we pay taxes to attack revolutionary struggles, to attack liberation struggles. It's wrong, but also we already know they'll do the same thing to us, especially if you're an African person in the United States. You know that our heroes have been assassinated by the U.S. government. Our organizations have been infiltrated by the U.S. government. Our elders, our heroes are locked up in concentration camps. And what's it called? What's it called when they put them alone by themselves? It's like torture. Solitary for years, decades, for fighting for us. So the U.S., the things that the U.S. has done to Cuba, they have done to the African liberation struggle domestically and internationally. So it's the same strategies coming from the same enemy. We have a responsibility to stop it, to cut them off. So let's talk about some of the many kinds of U.S. attacks on the Cuban Revolution. Probably like the most prominent, the one that folks are the most aware of, even though still a lot of people don't fully understand it, is the U.S. blockade on Cuba. The U.S. blockade on Cuba is the oldest economic sanction still in existence in the world. It is over 60 years old. It has cost the Cuban economy billions of dollars. It prevents Cuba from importing many, many basic goods. We just watched that Democracy Now! Video that talked about a plane crash in Cuba in the 2000s. It was not terrorism. It was the fact that Cuba, because of the U.S. blockade, cannot import parts to repair their planes. And then over 100 people died because they couldn't get those parts. That is just one example. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit and Cuba was trying to buy masks and ventilators and syringes, like basic medical supplies to protect its population, sales were canceled because companies were intimidated by the U.S. government. Sales were blocked after the goods had already been paid for, and sales were stopped at the inception because the companies did not want to risk getting fined under the U.S. government's blockade laws. So these are a couple of examples of how the blockade on Cuba affects day-to-day life, even during a crisis, for people on the island. Economic sanctions do not target parties. Economic sanctions do not target the people in charge. Economic sanctions deliberately target the most vulnerable sections of a population. Regular Cuban people are who are feeling the pressure and the suffering from this blockade, and that is the stated intent. In the legislation, in the meetings, the notes of the meetings, where the U.S. was developing the economic blockade on Cuba, they openly say that the intent of the blockade is to cause the Cuban people to suffer so much that they will overthrow their government, that they will overthrow their revolution. It's been over 60 years. It hasn't happened yet. Clearly, the blockade is not successful in those particularly political objectives, but the fact remains that the U.S. blockade on Cuba is causing regular Cuban people to suffer. It's causing regular Cuban people to be denied access to the materials they need for healthcare, to feed their families, to go to work. Like when I was in Cuba 2 years ago at this point, there was like rolling blackouts in certain neighborhoods because the U.S. intercepted a ship full of oil from Venezuela. They just cut it off. And the Cubans are, there's an island, there's no oil, so they couldn't fill their generators. So they couldn't keep the lights on. There were long lines for gas because there wasn't enough to go around. This is what it looked like on a day-to-day basis, thanks to the U.S. blockade on Cuba. So, comprehensive round of economic sanctions meant to make the Cuban people suffer. That is one example of an attack. Other examples of attacks are assassination attempts on Cuban revolution leaders. You might know that the U.S. government attempted to kill Fidel Castro over 600 times. That is like the leader that Cuban people chose. You might not care for him, perhaps because you're confused, but the Cuban people have the right to choose their leader. The U.S. just like spit on that. They were like, no, we don't like him. We would like to kill him. We would like to unilaterally overturn your decision by killing this guy. So the U.S. attempted to kill Fidel Castro over 600 times. Despite that, Fidel Castro died of old age, surrounded by his family members, comrades, and loved ones. Suck it. But the fact remains, the U.S. tried hundreds of times to kill this man. They successfully assassinated Che Guevara, and they've committed many dozens more assassination attempts on other Cuban revolutionary leaders, again in a doomed attempt to try to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, to try to overthrow the will of the Cuban people. Other attempts, we just saw this past summer, a U.S. aid and National Endowment on Democracy funded attempt at counter-revolution in Cuba. The Trump administration, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, applied a campaign of what they called maximum pressure on Cuba, escalating the U.S. blockade on Cuba at the same time as they knew that Cuba was cut off from funds from tourism because they had to lock down because it was a pandemic. At the same time as they knew that Cuba was sending doctors all around the world to help fight other nations or to help other nations fight this pandemic. Trump was like maximum pressure. Biden came in and was like even more maximum pressure. Now the U.S. blockade on Cuba is at a peak level. And as a consequence, because again, sanctions target the most vulnerable segments of a population, the Cuban people were suffering. The Cuban people were hungry. The Cuban people were fed up. They were like, what are we supposed to do? There's no food for our families. So they took to the streets. There was like a day of protests across the island of Cuba where folks were just asking for the economic pressure to be let up. And again, that was the intent of escalating the sanctions during a pandemic. And among that crowd that mobilized back in July, there were also artists, hip-hop artists, who were African, which is like shameful, and other like so-called civil society counter-revolutionary leaders who had been funded by U.S. government organizations, U.S. aid, and the National Endowment for Democracy, who were attempting to manipulate those protests into attacks against the Cuban Revolution. That's why you saw in the U.S. media, all of the coverage didn't talk about the blockade. What it did try to claim is that the people in the streets were tired of socialism and they wanted to overthrow it. And what that was like a attempted 1-2 punch. The one was the people on the ground funded by U.S. aid and NED attempting to escalate those peaceful protests and to attacks on the government. And the two was the U.S. media coverage that just erased the reason why the people were hungry in the first place, put it all on socialism, and gave those counter-revolutionaries a platform. That strategy of the U.S. funding opposition in Cuba has been repeated in countries targeted by imperialism all over the world. It is the primary strategy alongside sanctions and economic blackmail that the U.S. uses to attempt to subvert anti-imperialist nations. So U.S. aid and National Endowment for Democracy funding of the counter-revolution is an ongoing strategy to attack Cuba and again overturn the will of the Cuban people. Also, pair in pair with the funding of the counter-revolution, we are subjected to a continuous diet of lies about Cuba here in the United States. It's also happening on an international level, different by the US media. We are told that Cuba is a dictatorship. We are told that Cuba is oppressing its own people. When Antony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, announced yet more sanctions on Cuba this past month, he called for Cuba to release political prisoners. He said that people had been mistreated in the one-day of protest that happened back in July. That was like the pretext that they used to apply more sanctions. Meanwhile, Monica and I were talking about, right before the show came on, how they have African revolutionaries locked up, how they will extend, even if their sentence is up, they'll extend it for more time for no reason. They'll put them in solitary confinement. All those people ever did was fight for African liberation. And the United States is like, you are going to die in jail. So the U.S. has the largest prison population on the planet. The U.S. regularly locks up liberation fighters for the crime of resisting capitalism and imperialism. And the U.S. is now, with no sense of irony, I guess, pointing the finger at Cuba for so-called political prisoners and using that as a reason to make the Cuban people suffer more. So the U.S. constantly lies about Cuba. I can't even tell you how many times I'm watching like a random show and someone will say like a throwaway line about Castro being a dictator or like Che being a terrorist or about Cuba being a dictatorship. Just like all U.S. media, it's extremely common to find just like straight up lies about Cuba. And the intent of that is to indoctrinate us, to convince us of the lies about the Cuban Revolution, to convince us that socialism doesn't work, to convince us that Cuba, for some reason, is our enemy. That's why it exists. It is part of U.S. attacks on the Cuban Revolution. And the last thing that I want to mention, which we're going to go deep into today, is that the U.S. government has attempted to overturn the Cuban Revolution through open acts of terrorism. And by terrorism, I mean deliberate attacks on civilians, including children. The U.S. has used bombings, invasions, assassination attempts, biological warfare, and all means of extremely barbaric strategies to attempt to terrorize the Cuban people and again overturn the Cuban Revolution. And so for more information about that, I'm going to pass it to Monica.
Thank you so much, Onya Sawu, for setting that context. I just want to also share that after Fidel Castro overthrew the Baristas dictatorship, that the U.S. empire 4 months later was being involved in doing bombings and different things. And the Cuban government, they actually went to the UN. So they had documented of 20 different bombings, of pilots, of names of pilots, names of planes. They had all the receipts, all the details, everything. And U.S. Empire representative said, like, there's that the U.S. is not being aggressive towards Cuba, like none of that's real, right? And so even with all the evidence that was happening, even bombs being exploded as well, nothing happened. So I'm going to share some examples of like terrorism. So that was happening in 1960. And after, Cuba didn't come back and attack with violence, right? Try to interface with the UN to do something, UN did nothing about it, right? So then we see different attacks of terrorism that the US empire does and is doing on Cuban soil, right? So there's the Operation Northwoods. So what this did, Operation Northwoods did, I believe it might have been 1962. So like 2 years right after all the different bombings and things that they were doing in 1960, what they did was they were planning a proposal to provoke Cuba to go to war, as well as what they were trying to do is portray Cuba as a threat. That was the whole thing. They were trying to portray Cuba as a threat. They did it with Guatemala. They knew it was successful, and they were using a play out of their playbook to do it with Cuba. So this whole false narrative of Cuba being a threat. So what the plan was, some of the ideas in the plan was, of course, attempting to assassinate Castro. Well, actually trying to assassinate Castro was part of the plan. Some other proposed plans was like sinking Cuban refugee ships, hijacking planes, shooting planes down, bombing U.S. ships, but all to look like Cuba did it, right? So it would portray this anti-Cuba sentiment amongst this country, and also orchestrating violence in other cities, acting as if it was in the name of Cuba. So all of those things were under Operation Northwood. So some of those things actually happened. So bombings actually did happen. Bombings of planes and different things did happen in those proposed plans. There's also the Bay of Pigs, which many of you might be familiar with. And so, you know, Castro was very about removing the US empire from controlling Cuba, and believed that countries needed to have autonomy because imperialism actually creates so much damage and harm as they control many different countries. So the US didn't like that. The US didn't like that Cuba had a revolution and they're the socialist country that wants control for the means of the people to be met by the government. They don't want that, right? Because this is capitalist society that doesn't meet the needs of the people. And so what they did was they trained Cubans who were exiled from Cuba, and had basically an army of 1,400 people. And what they were doing was planning to invade Cuba. Well, Cuba found out, Castro and the leaders found out. And so what the attempt was, they were going to take planes and they were going to do airstrikes, and they moved the planes. And so they're like on this island where they're like exposed. And so 114 of them died, and they weren't successful, right, of the Bay of Pigs. But using like,
about the Bay of Pigs.
Yes, yeah,
Cool.
Definitely.
So yeah, like Monica said, that they trained Gusanos, they trained the Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. The Cuban people resisted it, like the Cuban military, but also like regular Cuban civilians who were like organized and trained in the committees for defense of the revolution resisted it. That's why the Bay of Pigs was stopped. But the U.S. for a long time denied any involvement in the invasion, like outright denied it. And in fact, one of the bomber jets was shot down by the Cubans. The pilot died. The Cubans, like if you go to the museum in Havana that used to be the presidential palace, you can actually see a part of the plane. But the pilot's body, like that American soldier, the U.S. left his body in Cuba. Cuba was like, would you like this back? And the U.S. is like, we don't know who that is. They left his body in Cuba for decades, denied to his family what had happened, and just let him rot there. And then decades later was like, okay, that was us. But that just like shows you, like that man gave his life for an extremely unworthy cause, was shot down by people defending themselves, and the people that sent him there pretended like they didn't even know who he was. So that just shows you what kind of people you are dealing with when you are fighting the U.S. empire.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes, it was supposed to be a secret, but right away people knew what happened, and I forgot about that. So thank you for sharing that. And then also like the bombing of Cubana Flight 455. So that was talked about on the video we were seeing before. So this bomb blew up in flight on the Caribbean Sea. Over 73 people died. On it was also 24 teenagers that were fencers. This was all orchestrated by the CIA, and who was involved is Luis Pasado Cariel. So Pasado literally worked for the CIA for over 25 years. He did this bombing, he did bombings of hotels, he did also things in Valenzuela as well. He was doing terrorist acts, killing people. And earlier you saw in the interview, the guy talked about how he escaped from Valenzuela prison. When they wanted to charge him, they didn't charge him for, this country didn't charge him for terrorism. Like all the documented crimes that he had done killing folks, especially the work that he was doing in Cuba, working for the CIA. So they were charging him with an immigration, like entering the country and not having documentation. And the judge dismissed it. She dismissed it because it was portraying justice, right? In the image of justice. That's why she dismissed it. And so it's because they didn't want him to for him to leak like a canary what was actually going on. of all the crimes that he was committing in the name of the US. So he was trained by the US, worked for the CIA for over 25 years, died at 90 years old, and nothing ever happened to him, right? Nothing ever happened to him. He was just walking around freely, living his life after killing countless lives in Venezuela as well as Cuba. And so wanting to also uplift during this time, the Cuban Five. So the Cuban Five came to the country, and what they were trying to do was stop terrorism from continuously happening in Cuba, because that's what this country was doing. It was doing continuous threats as well as terrorism on Cuba's soil. And so they were arrested for espionage and conspiracy to steal secret documents of the US empire, which wasn't true at all. None of it was true. They spent 17 months in a jail cell that was so tiny they couldn't even stand. 2 of them were denied the opportunity to see their wives. They were convicted under this injustice system that's not real. And there was so much anti-Cuban sentiment happening, right? And so they were convicted in 2001. They had a lawyer that was fighting for them and shared how there was not a fair trial that happened. So it was overturned in 2005. Then it was reinstated. So it was reinstated, and they literally stayed in prison for nothing. They didn't do anything at all. And so they did their sentence, and two of them finished their sentences, and 3 of them were swapped in 2014. There was a prison swap. Other acts of terrorism this country continues to do, right, is biological warfare. So there's over 30 documentations of biological warfare that focused on trying to do like disease in Cuba or destroy crops or anything, right? Anything that would kill lives or destroy access to food and resources. So an example is like in 1970, the US empire was caught seeding clouds over Cuba in an attempt to impact the sugar harvest. The project was part of a larger research plan called the Cooling, which was intended to devise ways of manipulating the weather for political reasons. And like, there's so many things that they've done up into even 2018, there's been biological warfare that's happened. Again, anything that would kill people, that would provide disease or would destroy crops for people not to have access to like land and being able to have access to resources and food. So those are just some examples of continuous terrorism that this country has acted on Cuba, like on actual Cuba soil.
So
Yes.
on the Venceremos Brigade, we went to Buy Cuba Pharma, which is like one of the companies in Cuba's biotechnology industry, which is like world renowned. And they told us about one of these incidents of biological warfare. One in particular, it happened in 1981. I just dropped the link to this timeline of incidents so you can see like how frequently the US tried this. So another example was in 1981, there was a sudden outbreak of hemorrhagic dengue fever in Cuba. 350,000 people got sick. 158 people, including many, many kids, also died from the disease. The disease was discovered later on to be the very same strain of hemorrhagic dengue fever that had been previously witnessed in New Guinea and in no other place on earth. In New Guinea in 1924, and then all of a sudden it showed up in Cuba in 1981. The outbreak began in Cienfuegos, and Camagüey, which are both cities that are very, very close to international air corridors. Camagüey actually has its own international airport. And just prior to the dengue fever outbreak in Cuba, it was discovered that the entire staff of the US military base in Guantanamo Bay had received vaccines against dengue. So there's very clear indication that there was US influence in the spreading of this virus out of nowhere And the U.S. made good and sure that none of its personnel on stolen Cuban land would be affected. So please check out that timeline that I just dropped in the chat, because like Monica said, this has happened over 30 times with many, many deaths, with attacks on crops, with attacks on livestock. So yes.
And so closing out the terrorism section, wanting to share, again, uplift what Onyesabu uplifted earlier. So it is our responsibility. We live in the belly here that we need to make sure that we're educating the people, telling them the truth about Cuba. Cuba is portrayed as this communist dictator. Well, not, I didn't mean communist, dictatorship is portrayed as this dictatorship. And it's really important for us to share with the people what's really happening, for us to teach people about what's happening in Cuba. That's so important. We know the Black Alliance for Peace, they have like lots of information on teach-ins, on where people could actually learn about Cuba. We must organize in solidarity. This country does not want people liberated. They do not want people free, because their role is to exploit people, get as much wealth as they can. They don't care if we live or if we die. Cuba is very different. Cuba is a socialist country. In Cuba, for example, they have for every one person, for every 120 people, there's one doctor. Here, for every 12,000 people, there's one doctor. Where do doctors live in Cuba? They live in the community. Where do doctors live here? We ain't even allowed in those communities. They live way on the hill where we couldn't even go, right? They don't live in our communities, right? And so it's very, very different. And so even during the pandemic, right, with the blockade, they went to over 21 different countries saving lives, providing medicine, right? And so that's why this country had to go hard on them, because Cuba's being celebrated all over the news, all their doctors, everything that they're doing in solidarity, doing medicine in solidarity. They don't want that, right? So this country, Biden even went harder than Trump. And so we have to tell the truth about what Cuba's done as well. We have to be vocal on the attacks that's happening. We have to call for the end of the blockade. And we have to also educate ourselves. Like I learned so much more about the biological warfare. I didn't even know about all those. I knew maybe about 3 of them. And so it's important for us to be in solidarity with the Cuban people. Onyesabu also mentioned, like Cuba's 70% African. Of course they don't want our people liberated and free over there in Cuba. So also, Onyesabu, do you want to talk about what happens every last Sunday of the month about the Solidarity Caravan for Cuba?
Yes. So all over the world, for I believe at least a year, on the last Sunday of each month, in noon your area's time, Cuba Solidarity organizers, the Cuba Solidarity Movement, has been organizing car caravans in support of the Cuban Revolution and against the U.S. blockade on Cuba. The car caravans actually started in Havana. The very first one was organized by Cubans, but it spread all across the world. So again, last Sunday of each month, which is going to be October 31st this month, here in Tiwa territory, it'll be at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. We're going to have our car caravan. We're going to have a rally with speakers, music, and food. We're going to have a costume party because it is Halloween. And we are going to be doing that in solidarity with a global movement calling for the end of the U.S. blockade on Cuba. This past summer, the UN General Assembly condemned the U.S. blockade on Cuba. Overwhelmingly, the majority of the nations on earth said to the United States, stop this blockade. So understand that when you rise up and you say not in our name, that you are siding with the majority of the Earth's population calling for this to end. So if you're on Tiwa territory, please come to our Cuba Solidarity Car Caravan and Rally Sunday, October 31st at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. If you're not in Tiwa territory, please find and support the caravan closest to you. If there isn't one where you are, then start one. I was like really shocked at how easy it is to organize a car caravan. And even if it's like 8 people, the caravan itself is like still really big because you got cars. So it doesn't have to be like a huge deal. Just call your friends together, get together on Sunday, October 31st, find a nice flat stretch of road with like people on it who will see you, decorate your cars and get going. It takes like an hour max. So please Join the movement calling for the end of the U.S. blockade in Cuba. Support a Cuba Solidarity car caravan in your area. If you're in Tiwa territory, come on Sunday, October 31st at 12 p.m. Mountain Time for our car caravan and rally. The flyer will be showed at the end of the show.
Thank you so much, Onyesawu. And that moves us into our New Mexico chapter updates and things that we can share with you all to get involved. So every Sunday, we do the Pan-African Community Garden. It's on Cesar Chavez and Arno. It's at 4 p.m. in the garden. We're getting ready to winterize the garden and winterize our fence. So come out, we'll have some political education. We're probably going to be out only a couple more times as it's getting cold in the garden, but really trying to winterize the space. That come out 4 o'clock this Sunday. Our elder care program, we started once the pandemic happened, providing resources as well as political education to our African elders in the community. We do elder care packages every Saturday. If you know an elder that would like a care package, hit us up. Or if you're an elder listening and would like a care package, please contact us as well. We would love to connect, to build community with you, as well as share food and share political education. Onyesawu already shared about the Cuban Solidarity Caravan. That's on October 31st at noon on San Mateo and Copper. There'll be a flyer for more information. Shout out to our comrades at John Brown Breakfast Club who will be cooking and sharing food at the end of the caravan as well. And people can dress up. They're supposed share more about the dress up opportunity.
So we want to do a Cuba Revolution themed. It's going to be organized by the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition and the New Mexico Benson MS Brigade. And what we have proposed is that you can either dress up as a hero of the Cuban Revolution or you can dress up as an American imperialist pig. Whatever you prefer. So we got folks that are going to dress as Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who helped initiate the U.S. blockade on Cuba. We have folks I'm going to dress up as Carlotta, the heroine of Cuba, the enslaved African woman that helped lead an uprising in the Matanzas region of Cuba in the 1700s. There's a comrade dressing as Che. There's a comrade dressing as Fidel. So it's an opportunity to get together a costume, your best Cuban Revolution regalia or your best imperialist pig costume. Please come through. Feel free to bring your kids, bring the whole family. It's going to be really cute.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Onyesawu. Also, the Anti-War Coalition is going to be doing a panel on anti-communist and imperialism. It's going to be on November 11th at 5 p.m. Shout out to all the people who are going to be on there. Erica Keynes is going to be on there. So excited. Dr. CBS, there's more to come. There'll be more information on the panel. It's going to be dope. Come through, come get some knowledge on that. Again, November 11th at 5 p.m. And I'm going to turn it over to Onyesawu.
Cool, thanks y'all. So we're bringing the episode to a close. We appreciate your participation and your comments. If you have not done so yet, please like the video. If you're watching on Facebook, like it. If you're watching on YouTube, thumbs up it. And please share it so more eyes can get access to this history piece. But this has been Weekly Pan-African News. My name is Onyesawu. This is my comrade Monica. We are both members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party New Mexico chapter. As a reminder, it is still a pandemic. Joe Biden, raggedy Joe Biden said it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. No, it is a pandemic for everybody. People are still dying by the thousands. There's a 9/11 every week in terms of deaths from COVID-19. And yet, there are no control measures currently in place. It's a vaccine, a mask, and you are on your own. Meanwhile, children are in schools just like a raw dog in COVID, no access to vaccination. People are still being evicted. People are still catching COVID at work and not having the healthcare to take care of themselves. It is a disaster. It is going to get much worse. Please remember, this is not over. I know you are tired. I am also very tired of this, but we cannot slack off because there is no one here to protect us but each other. There's no one here to protect us but each other. So please remember, it's still a pandemic. Please continue to wear your mask. Please continue to social distance. Please continue to be very, very, very careful about what kind of indoor events you attend. And definitely don't go to an indoor event without wearing a mask. If you are comfortable getting the vaccine, we encourage you to do so. But it's a personal choice. And also understand that every single one of us could be vaccinated and we would still need basic safety measures. We would still need mass testing. We would still need contact tracing. We would still need lockdowns to control the spread. We would still need eviction moratoriums, rent forgiveness, and basic stipends so people can stay home. Like, why did we only get 2 stimulus checks like a year ago? And now there's like no conversation whatsoever about it. And people are drowning. The official response to COVID in the United States is leaving us all behind. And they're turning around and trying to convince us to point the finger at each other. Always remember to point the finger up. Always remember to get the kind of response we need to disasters, to crises that are going to continue, that we must be organized and demanding it. They have to be scared to say no to us, y'all. And right now they are not. What we need to do is to join organizations fighting for justice. Join organizations demanding this safety net, demanding the end of imperialist attacks on countries fighting for liberation, demanding the end of this system that is exploiting us all and that is killing the planet. We need to be active in organizations fighting for a better world, fighting for our basic survival. So if you have enjoyed this program, if you've watched us every week, but you are not active in an organization fighting for justice, this is our direct ask to you to please join an organization fighting for a better world. We need all hands on deck. We need you personally. Yes, I'm talking to you specifically. We need you in this movement fighting beside us to build a better world before this system takes us all out. If the organization you want to see does not exist, then you are free to build an organization. You don't need anyone's permission, not mine, not Monica's, not no one's permission but your own. Just get 2 friends, pick a book you want to read together, and then figure out how you can apply the ideas you've learned from that book in the real world, in the community. That's all it takes. So please join an organization fighting for justice. Make sure that organization has PE, political education, for everybody. Make sure that organization has criticism, self-criticism. Make sure that's an organization where you can dissent, no matter who it is you're disagreeing with it. Make sure it's okay to do that. And make sure that's an organization where you understand the structure and where you can attain positions of leadership even if you want to. And if that organization does not exist, then please build it. We need you. Also, it is Thursday, which means there's new writing on the Hood Communist blog. Check it out at hoodcommunist.org. We have 4 new pieces, including the class analysis of Dave Chappelle that the past month of discourse was drastically missing. Please check it out. Please check it out, hoodcommunist.org. Join us next week on Weekly Pan-African News. We're going to be talking more about AFRICOM in an interview. So tune in Thursday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And thank you so much. Please stay tuned for flyers for upcoming APIP events and also some jams. Bye.
Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar, Badioni Azane, Azane,